started. You do your welcoming, and then I'll go introduce our speaker, and we'll go get the meeting going. Okay.
All
Thank you.
righty. Well, thank everyone for showing up tonight. I don't know if we have any from outside our area or not, but if you're outside of the Houston or the Clear Lake area, I just want to thank you for showing up. We always try to have interesting speakers, and I have to rely on Muhammad, who's been doing the lion's share of the work since I've been having a lot of problems with my house and other things. So I really give him kudos. And if you would like to join our group, it's $20 for a membership for a year and $30 for a family. So, and I think isn't it 15 for students if they want to join. But the main thing is we just like to have all of you here. We try our best to get interesting speakers. I have contacted someone for the October meeting if I can just get them to answer my email. I think we may have a really good one for October. And but I just want to thank all of you for being here, and be sure to come back next time for all of our meetings.
Thank you, Bob. Okay. So
Mohammed,
yes.
this is Louisa. Is it possible for members to get status on when their dues payment is due, since we haven't met in person for a long time? I know we were just mailing stuff in, but maybe somehow we could just know when we're due to resubmit our Amnesty dues.
Yeah. Okay, Louis, that's a good point. I will send out an email. Our normal, and Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, but our member cycle goes from January to December.
Yes, that's what we had decided. So if you haven't paid, Louisa, this year, then you need to pay. If you've already paid for this year, yeah, you're good.
Okay. Yeah, I just thought, yeah, I didn't realize that we were doing calendar years, so that's good to know. Maybe you could just send a note to everyone else, because someone asked me and I didn't know. So good point.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so um, I'm really excited about this speaker for today. This is something that we have not done, and a lot of our members had been interested in something like this. So our speaker today is Dallin Maybe. He is a Seneca and enrolled Northern Arapaho. He's raised on the uh, Dallin. If I'm not pronouncing this thing correctly, I apologize. Cattaraugus, territory of the Seneca Nation of Indians in the Western New York. He is an accomplished artist, public speaker, and performer, and is currently the Assistant Director of Development at the Native American Rights Fund, NARF. Dallin has a BA degree in philosophy as well as a Juris Doctorate from Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law with the emphasis on in federal Indian law. His title today of his talk is the human rights and other rights of the indigenous communities in our country. So please join me in welcoming Dallin Maybe from North.
Hi. Okay, thank you so much. Looks like a very interesting group. I would love to get to know most of you a little better sometime. I'm not sure if these meetings are open to the public or how it works, or if you just pay your dues even though you're outside the area.
Sure.
Yeah.
We've done a little bit of work, but I don't know that we've partnered with Amnesty International very much. But what I would like to do today is to kind of give a background on NARF, maybe a little bit on how I ended up there, and then the type of work that we engage in. We've been doing what we do for a little over 50 years. And so we're quite good at it. And there's very few law firms who offer the type of service that we do to Indian country. So thank you, Mohammed, for the invitation and the introduction. As he mentioned, I come from two tribes, the Northern Arapaho tribe and the Seneca Nation of Indians from Western New York. There are actually about 575 federally recognized tribes with a number of other tribes that are seeking re-recognition. For a variety of reasons, there are a number of tribes that just simply disappeared from the Federal Registry of Tribes. And there's a certain criteria that they have to go to basically demonstrate to the federal government that they still exist, that they still maintain a form of government, ceremony, language, all those things that, you know, people arguably say constitute a contemporary tribe today. So as most of you know, we have had a long and varied history with the United States from the very earliest immigrants that came to the US. Most tribal nations predate the United States form of government. As you know, most have their own language, their own ceremonies, their own cultural identity that is very distinct. Yet the body of law that kind of encompasses this relationship between the states and the federal government is incredibly complex and often varies in scope and in theme and in you know, the different topics that come up for resolution, especially when it comes to policy and legislation regarding the relationship. And so I don't want to so much get into how we ended up here, but I definitely want to talk about some of the contemporary issues that we constantly and continually face. Some of our litigation efforts have lasted 30 and 40 years, almost as long as we've been around. So as I mentioned, the Native American Rights Fund is about 52 years old. They started as an initiative of the California Legal Service Project that was partially Ford Foundation funded. Some new attorneys recognized that there was a need for tribes to have effective legal representation advocacy. They started kind of a pro bono nonprofit law firm. They based themselves out of Southern California because there are a large number of tribal populations throughout California, but quickly realized that you know, when you have one beneficial or even a detrimental decision that impacts one tribe, it has the potential to impact all tribes. And so they realized that they needed to serve tribes throughout the country rather than in one particular region. So they moved to Boulder. They formed a small partnership with CU Boulder, partly because they had a research library there and they had wanted to start kind of an Indian legal program that examines the ways in which this federal trust relationship exists and where it's going to go. And so we have an office in Boulder, Colorado. The main office, we're approximately 21, 22 attorneys with another 50 people in our support staff. We have an office in Washington, D.C., and then we have an office in Alaska as well. As I mentioned, it's estimated we've represented over 300 of the 575 federally recognized tribes, and we are able to provide high-level legal advocacy, often pro bono. A lot of law firms will have pro bono efforts, but very few of them can take on a case, especially with complex litigation that might endure years and years. Whereas we have a large portion of our budget contributed by individual donors, corporations, foundations, of course, and even a handful of tribal nations who recognize the importance of our work and our programs and want to assist accordingly. So it's estimated we have approximately 50 given litigation and programs going at any given time. And it really runs the breadth of Indian law. It's probably easier to say what we don't do and then get into all the other stuff that we do. We don't practice a lot of criminal law, things that have to do with criminal justice. We have done a little bit on the rights of prisoners, on their ability to practice their ceremonies and maintain their cultural identity. but generally criminal justice is stuff that we don't get into. We also don't represent tribes versus other tribal nations. When they have conflicts, we like to leave it to them to figure out. We serve Indian country as a whole rather than just a few. But we're guided by essentially 5 mission priorities. We have a board of 13 right now, tribal leaders from indigenous communities throughout the country, including Hawaii. And we really rely on them and their expertise, their professional acumen, all the things necessary to stay abreast of whatever issues and challenges may arise. And then once we're aware of it, and once a tribe decides that they need some assistance, they'll put in a request. And that request then goes through a litigation management committee. We assess not only our ability to take on the case, but its importance in Indian country, because unfortunately we get so many requests, we just simply cannot engage in all of them. So we have to be pretty selective about what we do and how we do it. But these 5 priorities really guide the types of cases that we take on. So the first one, of course, is preserve tribal existence. We have a long, complex history, some tribes more than others, and how we've engaged with these visitors to our tribal territories. And we really forged a lot of relationships. We'll talk about treaty rights a little bit, because in terms of fundamental human rights, a lot of that expectation that we have from the federal government especially comes from the concessions that we make in exchange for certain promises. And they're simple health and welfare promises. They promise to educate and assist us in technical and vocational training and all these other things that were meant to replace what we were giving up. We were giving up in a lot of ways our traditional homelands, the areas that we subsistence hunted and farmed, all these millions and millions of acres of lands and natural resources were given in exchange for these promises. And so when we say that we will hold the government accountable, we expect them to fulfill their promises. And we've seen some pretty significant decisions in the last couple months. I'm looking at the chat box here, and what we'll do is it'll be a little easier to maybe plow through some of this and then answer a few specific questions. But then toward the end, we can really get into maybe stuff that I haven't touched on or things that you've always wondered. This is really a safe space. There is probably no question about Native American culture that I haven't heard. So feel free if it's always been in the back of your mind somewhere. But the preservation of tribal existence and the protection of our inherent sovereignty is really the linchpin of our cultural identity. We simply want to exist according to our traditions, our customs, our ceremonies, our understanding of our place in the universe, and everything else, is part of that. Interestingly, there's been significant federal regulation that has inhibited, in a lot of ways, our ability to decide for ourselves the hows and whys and things of what we're doing. For example, the Indian Gaming and Regulatory Act, it's allowed us to engage in an economic exercise called gaming, where you see some tribes have rather large casinos. They employ hundreds of people, often the majority that aren't tribal members. They've really become an economic engine. But when it comes to that ability to simply engage in gaming, the Congress forced us to mediate with the states and say, we will profit share with you in exchange for the ability to simply engage in this activity. There is no other industry that is required to profit share with the state. You can say, well, taxation is a bit of profit sharing. Yeah, well, yes and no. I think the tribes would much rather pay a tax to the state than profit share. It's just a little interesting thing to think about as people have defined what tribal sovereignty means and how it's exercised. So another mission priority is the protection of natural resources. you know, it's you can argue that a lot of tribal communities are not within their traditional boundaries. They were removed for various reasons, usually access to natural resources that the US or the states wanted. But it's been interesting. A few tribes that thought they were in the middle of nowhere often were sitting upon millions of barrels of oil or lots and lots of timber, things that often precious metals like uranium and gold. So it was often years later after these things had happened that they realized they still had access to some significant revenue if they so chose. Some tribes have chosen not to mine. Other tribes have chosen to engage in that kind of activity to just simply take advantage of the blessing that those natural resources will give them. Our third priority that I'd definitely like to talk a little bit about today is the promotion of Native American human rights. And this also has in large measure to do with the exercise of inherent tribal sovereignty. It's simply living according to the cultural identity of each tribal nation. But it also means things like voting rights, being able to exercise and participate in the election process, this political process that really gives power to a tribal community when it comes to not only their own elections for elected officials, but even local things like school boards. Oftentimes people say, well, why isn't more, you know, Native American history being taught? Because it really is our collective history. Why isn't it being taught more in the schools apart from Thanksgiving? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and some of that has to do with the makeup of the school boards for the last 100 or 200 years. But if there is even one Native American or one interested individual, you would often see some of those things change. And so participating in that fundamental democratic right is a big part of what we're doing, especially in the last few election cycles. We're seeing an extremism on both sides that has been unprecedented. And it's a little unfortunate because we definitely have traditional forms of mediation and conflict resolution that we exercise and we seek to implement. Some tribes are relearning some of these things. Well, I was just going to mention something about that. Oh, I did want to say that we are bipartisan in nature. We've sued administrations on both sides of the aisles for varying levels and varying deficiencies of living up to these treaty rights and their obligations. So just kind of keep that in mind. You know, we're living in a world where you know, we're facing contemporary political issues just as much as every other community throughout the United States. It just affects us a little differently because we have to take into account, you know, our tribal status and sovereignty, as well as our relationship with the states around us, and then ultimately the federal government. So accountability is big. That's a large part of our mission. We'll take on, you know, states for a variety of issues, whether it's water rights and priorities, educational issues, free exercise of our religions, all those things that the promises that were made, all those things that were made on behalf of different state and federal governments. We're going to hold governments accountable and expect them to live up to it. And then ultimately, the last priority is the development of Indian law. So as I mentioned before, federal Indian law is the body of law that really has to do with any policy or legislation, any casework or decisions that come from district courts all the way up to the Supreme Court, anything that might impact Indian country. We hope to grow that body of law. You know, we'd love to live in a world where it's defined and there's no more question about the hows and whys, but the reality of that is very different. And so we expect to continue to be on the forefront of some of these major decisions that allow us to simply be who we are today. Do we have any questions so far?
Yeah, we got tons of questions over there. So I'll start with Bob Tomlinson. Bob, can you unmute and ask your question, please?
Well, I really appreciate this program and thank you for being on here today. We have, as you know, we're experiencing at this time a lot of voter suppression laws in different states. And I know that you had a problem this last election. And I think it was one of the Dakotas, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
So what is going on about Native Americans being able to vote? Is there a voter suppression to Native Americans, or is it just an area, or is this getting better?
Well, it's probably getting worse. You're absolutely correct. There was a series of voter registration laws that are arguably well intentioned. They have a real impact on the disenfranchisement of often very certain subsections of the American population, Native Americans included. And what we saw in this last election especially was an unprecedented turnout for Native voters. And in some states with significant Native populations, it changed the color of that state. Wisconsin and Arizona are some prime examples. You know, when an election is being decided by even a few thousand people or 5,000 people, when your community is 20,000 and you've got 16,000 over the age of 18 who can vote, you can bet that vote is going to have an impact. And, you know, it's unfortunate, but for a long time, you know, we weren't even US citizens until 1922, even though we've served in every major conflict as allies of the US and its soldiers. But it wasn't even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I remember hearing, it doesn't do us any good if we vote because it just doesn't have any impact. The real sort of real apathy about
Hey, Dula, can you mute yourself, please? Thank you. Go ahead. Go down.
So yes, their answer is yes to all of the above. And I don't think there probably are some areas that are specifically targeting the Native population, especially if they're larger tribal communities. We spearhead a program called the Native American Voting Rights Coalition. It was pretty new within the last 10 years or so. And at first it was just to simply identify the challenges to Native voter participation. And so we did some surveys and we just found some incredibly appalling situations. No polling places within 90 miles. You couldn't ballot collect. You couldn't engage in mail-in voting. And for a lot of tribal members who live in remote areas, it was just unrealistic to take work off and, you know, travel 3 hours to participate. And so there just wasn't a big voter turnout. And then you'd have things like the redistricting and gerrymandering that really divided up the strength of certain communities amongst other communities to dilute that power. And so when you don't see people on the school board or on the zoning commission, oftentimes it's very targeted. There's very specific reasons why. And so this Voting Rights Coalition is made up of NARF, National Congress of American Indians, the ACLU, a handful of voting rights organizations and tribal sovereignty organizations like Four Directions. I think I saw that in the comments in the chat box. It's really, and you know, academics and voting rights scholars. We all sort of strategize together to identify these challenges and then figure out some resolution. We conducted a series of field hearings throughout Indian country. We prepared a report that you can find online, actually, as well as see the strategy of NARF when it comes to tackling these voting rights issues. So we filed litigation in the North Dakota case. That was actually a really interesting test model because it was one of the first ones that said, well, you know, we're going to require a physical address on your state issued ID. Well, that's great, except what happens when the reservation has no physical address because they've just got one post office box in a small branch somewhere. It really divided up the community. And interestingly, even in one of the last elections, the district court said, well, yes, it's going to disenfranchise voters, but it's not too many people, so we're going to go ahead and allow it to happen. Well, thankfully, we were able to appeal it, and when it looked like they were going to lose on the merits, The state of North Dakota did come back and resolve every single issue that we had. We've gotten the U.S. Postal Service to actually provide physical addresses now. Not every community still has that, but we're working on it. And then this last election cycle, of course, we saw some big results. And now we're also seeing some huge efforts to disenfranchise not just us, but a whole block of voters for a variety of different reasons. So we're taking on those issues, and it's a large part of what we're doing right now. You know, with the completion of the 2020 census, which is actually getting close to being released, a lot of these districting commissions are going to meet and start to divide up, and we're anticipating seeing some really crazy gerrymandered maps. And so we're already planning which cases we're going to probably tackle and file litigation on. It should be really, really interesting, but you can follow it on our website. We usually post case updates. We provide a variety of kind of case summaries and what's happening in Indian country and how it impacts us. But we definitely believe in coalition building, because a lot of our issues aren't just our issues. You know, a lot of our pipeline fights definitely impacted the waterways and the aquifers of tribal communities. But it's not just us. Those pipelines will cut through a variety of states, a variety of ranchers and farmland. And when they saw the eminent domain of some of their property for these pipelines, they realized, holy smokes, this is our fight as much as it is these tribal communities. And so that's been nice too. It's being able to
right. Okay, next one is Dula Abdu. Dula, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please? Okay, Dula Abdu. All right, so we're gonna skip to, let's see, Bert. Bert, and unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Okay. Well, this wasn't my question, but you know, I've had the thought several times that if I could vote on it, I'd probably vote to turn back over our country to the indigenous people. You took a lot better care of it than we had. Might have a chance of surviving. But my question is, I don't really understand tribal sovereignty. What's the relationship between a tribe and the United States government? What's the difference between standing of a member of a tribe and me as not a member of a tribe?
Okay, well, in its simplest terms, tribal sovereignty is simply the ability of a nation to act in their own interests. So however they want to live, however they want to govern, they should be able to do that. Most, you know, when the U.S. was set up and they decided they were no longer going to be citizens of whatever sovereign, France or England or wherever they came from, they said, okay, we need a form of government that we can define. And so through you know, the original articles and eventually the Constitution, they started to define this 3-tiered structure, this checks and balances, this ability to govern ourselves as we see fit. They wanted to decide everything from taxation to the relationships of the states to the federal government. And that's essentially what tribal nations are doing as well. So there's been a series of decisions, oftentimes through legislative acts of Congress, and then later interpretation by the Supreme Court that have said, okay, so these are tribal nations. We've engaged in treaties with them. They've conceded vast amounts of land and natural resources in exchange for whatever it is. How do we define that relationship with the United States? And so you can Google things like the Marshall Trilogy, and it'll lay out some of the earliest Supreme Court decisions that said that really kind of developed law in an area that there was no real law. They sort of made it up. They said, well, they're kind of like wards of the federal government, even though they're tribal nations and governed themselves for millennia before we got here. We're gonna create a whole bureau. The Department of the Interior is gonna have an Indian section that can figure out these treaty rights, that can figure out how to fulfill these treaty obligations and define what it means to be a tribal community, a tribal nation today. So the relationship has been evolving and growing depending on how it's been interpreted. And so case decisions will define things like taxation and how, for example, how much of an ability that a tribal nation has to criminally prosecute its own members, let alone members who are just US citizens. There was a recent decision in Oklahoma that really threw people for a loop because it seemed very convoluted and very difficult to understand. And there was some real salacious titles in the media saying, oh, half of Oklahoma is Indian country now, and it's going to go back to tribal nations and all this other stuff. Well, what it really was how Indian country is defined. The case itself was a criminal law case. A tribal member had done some horrible stuff. There was no doubt that he had done some horrible stuff. He was prosecuted for it in state court and he was in prison. But as part of his appeal, he said, well, it looks like the state of Oklahoma and US Congress never really ceded these lands to the state, and therefore their prosecution of me was illegal. Major crimes like rape, kidnapping, murder, homicide, those are only prosecuted in federal court by special US attorneys. All the other crimes, smaller petty crimes, probate courts, those things can be decided in tribal court, but the major stuff was supposed to be left to the feds. And so this guy argued, well, the state prosecuted me, they didn't have the jurisdiction to do so. And he appealed it all the way up to the federal Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court came back and said, you know, he's right. We had promised that we would take on some of these cases, that it shouldn't be left to the state, that Congress had in fact not ceded clearly enough the lands in Oklahoma that are no longer considered Indian land, but really are under some of our earliest treaties and legislative acts. He was prosecuted incorrectly. And so what that meant was, you know, of course, the feds will have to re-prosecute him in federal court, and they have. But more importantly, you know, Justice Gorsuch, his decision was amazing. He said, we made obligations to tribal nations, and it's about time that we live up to them. When you read the Constitution, it says treaties in the US Constitution are the supreme laws of the land. So we expect those promises to be upheld. And so, you know, like anything else, tribes that live within certain states are going to have to figure out how to get along, how to figure out things like taxation and criminal justice and you know, how can we forge a positive relationship that recognizes tribal sovereignty and our ability to simply be who we are and our relationship with the state. So that was a little bit long. There is an Indian law in a nutshell book that's produced mostly for law students, but it really does a good, it's been, you know, reworked a dozen times to update new casework and laws and things, but it has a good summary of that relationship between the US and then states and tribes. And then it brings up summaries of all the cases, the major cases that have impacted Indian country. And it's some good reading. It's simple, it's not real dense. You don't have to read 300-page decisions. It's all right there. It's quick reading.
Well, I might like to read that. What's the name of it?
Indian Law in a Nutshell. You can find that pretty easy just with that.
All right, so the next one is Dula Abdu back. Dula, do you want to unmute and ask your question now?
Okay, I am sorry. I usually like to write them because I am not a good English speaker. However, I will try. My question is, for example, what is the total Indian population, and why is not the Indian population has not overcome the economic and the political disparity for a long time? How long would it take, and what's going to take to reach parity with the power to be in the USA? That's my question.
Okay,
Wow.
there's a lot to unpack there. So I'm not sure what this latest census will reveal, but I think the last numbers were around 3.5 million natives throughout the federally recognized tribes. Now, when it comes to the economic disparity, some tribes are doing quite well.
I mean, why don't we just use,
This is for me.
Mr. Dula.
why don't we just use, I'm thinking they've got, the sidewalk lots?
Mr. Dula, can you, yeah, thank you.
Oh, I thought, okay,
Go ahead,
a follow-up question. You know, as I mentioned before, the economic disparities happen for a lot of reasons. You know, we conceded a lot of land in exchange for certain promises. And so certain people and families and industries have had generations to build wealth. You know, they've built wealth off their lands and the natural resources. Let's say, you know, somebody gets 200 acres as part of a settlement action, not said legal settlement, but maybe they settled it and farmed, built a small house and ranched. Now their kids have one less thing to worry about. They've got something that's considered real property that they can leverage for whatever they want. Other people have built big business off of some of these natural resources using things like oil and gas and timber. But when you really ask, well, why are certain people doing a lot better than others? There's plenty of reasons for that. And it's most evident in any marginalized minority culture. There was very concentrated efforts to suppress Native peoples, the Black community. The Tulsa race riots were a perfect example of that. They destroyed entire communities because they built their lives around this racism, this perception that somehow they were better and that they were going to oppress a whole bunch of people in their ability to be successful because of this racism. There's actually a Martin Scorsese film in production right now that deals a lot with the Oklahoma land grabs and how certain allotments were given to tribal members and they were murdered for it. They were, you know, they were forced to marry, they were killed. Their lands then passed out of, Native hands and into the hands of non-natives. It should be very, very, it's called Flowers of the something moon, but it should be very, very eye-opening when it comes to how some of this stuff has happened and why we are where we are now. And so combating the racism and the poverty that was derived from that racism, you know, we've had varying assimilation policies throughout our history. The goal was often said to kill the Indian and save the man through forced education, removal from tribal communities. This boarding school issue right now is a direct offshoot of some of those policies. You know, kids were killed after they were removed from their communities. They were never able to go home. And the ones that did return often returned having suffered physical, mental, and sexual abuse. It started a cycle of abuse that has persisted. And it's just one more thing that tribal communities often have to deal with. And, you know, again, there are tribal communities that have become highly successful. They've branched out into a variety of economic engines. They fund their own, they don't tax their own people. They don't tax often the industry that they've built up, but they use, unlike corporations, they use their profits to just simply funnel back into their communities. So they fund their own police departments, fire departments, ambulance service. Oftentimes they'll supplement federal health care, which is not the best by any means, but they'll build their own clinics and hospitals. They'll create social programs for their elders and disadvantaged. They build amazing rec centers, and a lot of it's on their own without taxation. It's pretty incredible. So how will they you know, I think as long as we slowly inch ourselves out from under the thumb of the federal government, we can attain some of these goals. Like I said earlier, we have to profit share with states to preserve this quote unquote ability to game, while the state continues to undermine those efforts by creating their own casino, racino tracks and things that mimic gaming, but aren't enough to violate some of those state tribal compacts. It's really an interesting thing, but a lot of it's going to come just by folks like us and even tribal attorneys advocating for their clients and their tribal communities to just simply make things more equitable. You know, there's terrible stories about tribal communities and the non-native communities that surround those reservations. There's definitely some very, very real racism and discrimination that still exists there. So it's going to take quite a bit, but that's probably why we do what we do.
Okay. Hey, and the next one is Luisa. Luisa, can you unmute and ask your question?
I can.
Dallin, can you come a little closer to the mic? You're kind of going in and out.
Sure.
Thank you. All right, Luisa.
Yes, I think you probably already touched on this with the other questions. My question was really kind of on a more, I guess, a more micro level. I was wondering about, what areas, if there was a swath of areas in some states where the Native American folks are able to control their own schools and hospitals, and what are those success stories in terms of, having ownership and control over their core institutions? So that's kind of where I was headed.
Okay. Well, again, it depends on the tribal nation and what kind of economy they have there. Gila River is a great example of a community that's used their infrastructure funds to create their own schools. A lot of them often started with federal and state funding, but as they've gotten to be more and more successful, they just simply invest. They've built wonderful clinics and hospitals that eclipse the Indian Health services in the area. It's interesting. When I was living in Chandler and I was working for the community, my kids were going to school at the elementary school that the tribe controlled. And we were living off the reservation since we aren't tribal members. And my wife at the time was having a conversation with her neighbor and asking her about the schools. And the neighbor was actually on the school board and was so excited and telling her about the programs and said, we've got 5 laptops in each room and access to Wi-Fi and all this exciting stuff. And my wife turned to our middle child and said, "Hey, how many laptops do you guys have in your class?" And she looked at her and she said, "What do you mean?" She's like, "Well, how many laptops do you guys have?" She's like, "Well, we all have our own." I guess her eyes got big and she said, "Oh, well, okay." But it was interesting to see that kind of success. And the tribe pays well, so they're able to attract some great teachers and they provide a lot of great benefits. But unfortunately, not every tribe is like that. So it just sort of, again, depends on the tribe and the situation. Where I grew up, I went to a public school off reservation. Most of the Indian kids went to another public school that was right off the reservation. They have since started kind of a Montessori school for elementary grade school kids, where they teach, it's kind of a Waldorf model, but they do teach a heavy dose of Seneca culture and speak in Seneca language. It's really exciting. But again, it all depends on the type of infrastructure that the tribe can put together.
Okay. Hey, Robert Sanchez, you're next. Unmute and ask your question, please.
Okay, first of all, thank you for taking the time to speak with us tonight. And I wrote my question in the general chat room, and I've heard that one of the major difference between Native Americans and any other marginalized groups is that Natives went through everything else that everybody else went through: slavery, segregation, discrimination, racial violence, but they went one beyond genocide. And I know that's a very sensitive topic, and a lot of the conservatives, those on the right, say, well, it's just about germs, that there was no intentions of killing off the tribes. But if you look at whether it's from bounties on native lives, massacres, engineered famines, like the killing of the bison, engineered epidemics, smallpox blankets, there's got to be some intention behind that. And just reading some of the correspondence, official and private, of some of the movers and shakers, you could see the intent there. And I just want to get your opinion on that.
No, you're absolutely correct. You know, we from our earliest relationships with the young United States, the Iroquois Confederacy actually some of the nations sided with the United States and the revolutionaries, but like the Seneca, we sided with the British. They treated us like sovereigns. We had forged alliances with them and relationships with them, and we fought the young United States. In fact, you know, we had we called George Washington, translated to destroyer of towns, because when he would come through and engage in conflict, he wouldn't just defeat the population and then kind of take the supplies. He just burned everything. He burned orchards and farming. He burned longhouses and supply stores. It really was, they really were war crimes. And so when we see the reverence that a lot of people have for some of these early presidents, I mean, Abraham Lincoln, great. There was probably some other reasons why he felt that segregation and these racist policies weren't the best answer. But he was also the president that greenlit one of the largest mass hangings of not just us, but anybody. At one point, there was some there was some events that occurred in South Dakota, and they weren't sure who it was, so they arbitrarily rounded up 38 men. Well, I think it was actually 80 men from one particular tribe, and just said, well, we're going to execute them, even though they may or may not be. There was no due process. There was nothing for these warriors. And Abraham Lincoln, he commuted the sentence of all but 38. But at the end of the day, he still executed 38 men who it looks like were innocent of these things. But you know, and now their busts are on some of the sacred Black Hills, where we conducted ceremonies forever and ever. So it's a constant reminder of those genocidal policies, some of those war crimes. There's it's no wonder that some Native activists are absolutely angry over some of these things.
All right, Dylan, I'm gonna ask you the last question.
Okay.
Our group members and our friends and guests, we like to take action. So, what action can we take to help your organization, NARF, and in general indigenous communities? Give us an action so we can follow through and help whatever we can do to help the issues.
No, that's great, and we're grateful for that. You know, one of the best things that you can do is to just become educated about the facts. There's so many misconceptions about Native culture in general, and then our issues. The more people that know what they are and why they're important and why we fight, the better. You can educate your friends and family. You can help us generate allies who can explain to their networks and their relationships. You can donate to the cause. You know, we've a website that's just full of all kinds of information where you can get updates about you know, whatever it is, the casework that we're working on, because I'll bet you it's going to impact everybody at some point. Water has become a huge issue. You know, I think due to climate change, we're going to see decreasing amounts of water, and people are going to try and commodify it and figure out how to profit off of these water priorities. And luckily, there's established water law that provides for some tribes to take advantage of X amount, but they're long and hard battles that take quite a bit of time to navigate and find resolution. But like I said, you know, if you're interested in religious freedoms, we do a lot with repatriation and protection of sacred sites, and we spend a lot of time explaining why we do some of these things on our website. And if you feel inclined to support it, then by all means, you know, if friends are looking for somewhere to encourage maybe their place they work, their corporation, to donate, NARF is a great place. Like I said, there's no other legal firm quite like us. We actually have a special 501c3 designation from the IRS because we do have a few tribes that can afford some of our legal fees. Our legal fees are nominal compared to other big firms that are similar in size and scope and impact. But we do that because we know that the majority of tribes just simply can't afford to pay for the representation that we provide.
All right, thank you. Oh, I just noticed that Bridget has a couple of questions. So
Okay.
we have about 5 minutes left. So Bridget, can you unmute and ask your question, and then Dallin can answer those questions? Or should I just go ahead and read? No, Bridget, go ahead.
Well, thank you for that, but I was in the middle of typing it right when you said, I'll to ask the last question. So,
Good.
actually, there are two questions because I know here. Well, the second question, I was thinking about, like here in Texas when we have the Carrizo Camaracuerdo tribe that's not federally recognized, and some other tribes that may not be federally recognized, and how that may or affect them for better or worse. And the second question is, there are a couple, some tribes that cross international borders, and how do you represent those, and maybe that's too complicated a question to ask. Both of those are kind of complicated.
Well, it's not too complicated because unfortunately we don't do a whole lot with especially international issues. And I'm trying to think of a case where we might have represented a tribe that has dual citizenship in Mexico and the US, or in Canada and the US. As far as state recognized tribes, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that we can do. We have helped a number of tribes regain federal recognition, either through congressional action or through this federal recognition process. But it's a tough road for sure. And I really feel for some of those communities that are just fighting to get back recognition. Unfortunately, there's a lot of groups that have very tenuous ties or no tenuous ties at all, who are clamoring for state recognition, and they'll never make it through the federal process, but they try to, and oftentimes they get it. They get state recognition for whatever benefits that they may feel they can get through the state. We don't really do anything with that. We leave that to the Department of the Interior to handle in the Bureau of Indian Affairs more than we, unless we had a tribal client that for some reason took issue with them. But again, we don't really get into tribe on tribe stuff, so I don't know that we would even get involved in anything like that anyway. But for the international stuff, we do some international work, but it's more stuff for the United Nations. It's more intellectual property rights, things like that.
All right. Hey, thanks a lot, Dallin, and I want to thank all of you for attending this meeting. I personally learned a lot, and I'm gonna go see if I can get that book to read that.
The nutshell.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And then Dallin, I put that in the chat. The name of the movie is Killers of the Flower Moon.
Right, that's right.
And it's coming up, and there's a book by the same name.
Yeah.
The
based
movie
on
is
the book.
based on that. And of course, I want to thank everyone for this meeting. And our next meeting is on September 6th. It is Labor Day, and if Mr. Tomlinson and others decide that if we're not going to have the meeting on Labor Day, we'll move it, but we'll let you know. But right now, it looks like September 6th is the next meeting, and we're working really hard to bring a good speaker for that meeting also.
And if you have any questions or something pops into mind, just let me put my email address in the chat box, or you can just reach me on the NARF website. I think there's a general email. I think it's just info@narf.org, and it'll make its way to me eventually. But here, let me just put my email in the chat box.
Yeah, or Dallin, I can share your email address with the membership,
Yeah,
and they can directly ask you questions. Okay.
sure.
All right.
Thank
Okay,
you so
folks.
much.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you guys.
Thank you. It was great. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you.